Hello and welcome to another episode of Climate Watch. I'm Fei Fei. Planting trees is good for the planet. But what happens after we plant a lot of trees? And here in China, people start to have revelations about managing forests. It is so much more than just putting saplings in the ground and hoping for the best. It's a science and also an art that goes way beyond what most people realize. China has spent the past 5 decades greening its land with massive efforts like the 3 North Shelter Belt project. We actually did an episode about this particular project before. You can check out the link in the description below. So, how has forest management evolved here in China over the years? And recently, I've been hearing more and more experts and policymakers talk about forests playing the role of full treasures. What exactly does that mean? And how does it connect to our broader goals for climate action, environmental protection, and biodiversity? In this episode, with all the questions, I sat down with Lei Xiangdong. He's the Deputy Director of the Institute of Forest Resource Information Techniques at the Chinese Academy of Forestry. It is one of China's oldest and most respected forestry research institutes. The reason we invited Professor Lei is that we want to talk more about China's forest management and the changes and the shifts in mindset about afforestation, and also how we view the role of forest in our ecosystem. Welcome, Professor Lei.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So let's start first with some basics. When we're talking about forests, the first thing for a lot of people would think about tree planting, because that's mainly a lot of our publicity and also efforts been taking place over the past few decades. But could you help us understand what really effective forest management entails for today?
When we talk about forest management, actually it involves the planning and the implementation of activities that aim to achieve specific objectives like timber production, recreation, restoration, and conservation. So it covers the whole process, including the forest inventory, planning or silviculture design, implementation, monitoring, evaluation, and also adjustment. So tree planting is just a start. It's often said that there are 3 parts to planting and 7 parts to management. So here for forest management activities can cover like the weed control, fertilization, seeding, harvesting, and also habitat and soil management. As for the effective forest management, could continuously meet the needs of humankind with the maintenance of intrinsic of forests. For example, the capacity of natural regeneration, health, vigor, biodiversity, and resilience, and also sustainability.
That sounds like a whole lot of work, basically a very systematic field of work that's definitely more than about planting trees. In fact, China has been recognized globally for the large-scale afforestation efforts. For example, the most famous one is the 3 North Shelter Belt project, which this podcast also covered last year. But in that project, I think the main focus is about planting trees. But now, how has China's approach to forest and forest management, as you just talked about, over time? And what are some of the key milestones or challenges or lessons we learned through this journey?
The forest management in China definitely evolved with our socio-economic development. Firstly, the objectives changed. As we know, in the early when the foundation of the new China, the main objectives are timber protection for the country's, economic construction, and then to the ecological protection with a natural disaster occurred like the flooding in 1998, and also to now the multifunctionings with the multiple requirements from the public. So correspondingly, the forest management practice changed, from the clear cutting in the early time as the core, and then to the large scale forestation, as you mentioned, and to quality improvement currently through the proper silviculture practice. As for the key milestones, I think there are some. Firstly, it's the strategy of classified forest management. Our forests are divided as commercial forest, which means the main objective for the economic benefits, and ecological public welfare forests, or we call it ecological forest, for ecological benefits. That's formed in 1995. And for the governments, they will give the eco compensation for ecological forest. And the second one is a natural forest protection project in 2000. And also the third one is a financial subsidy for our thinning project in 2009. And the government encouraged people to make thinning across the country for the quality improvement. And the fourth one is in 2013, Chinese government released the National Reserve Forest to ensure the safety of the timber supply. And also, in 2015, there is logging ban for natural forests across the country. And also in 2016, China released its first master plan for national forest management from 2016 to 2050. That plan describes the target, the pattern, and the route of sustainable forest management in future 35 years. And also recently in 2023, the State Forest and Grassland Administration initiated a pilot site demonstration for sustainable forest management. The amount of the sites amounts to 368. During this process, we also affirmed our principles of forest management, like close to nature, that means the nature solution based, and the multifunctional, and how we can design or make our plan in the whole cycle, not just one time. And also, we emphasize the precise design. During the process, we also face some challenges. For example, we have very limited space for forestation, since there's a large scale of forestation in the past years, and currently the land is very tough, for planting trees. And the second one, our current forest, it has a poor standard quality, and there is the over dependence on monoculture. Most of forests are pure forest, and also we faced the risk of the dry and insect and disease attack for the forest. And also we have the absence of market-based mechanism for environmental service. That's how we can make green to gold. So we do have some lessons. For example, how we can plant right trees in right place. That means how we can match trees with the site, and the timely thinning is very important and not overlooked, and how we can establish the decision-making tool or software in our forest management practice, and how we can establish the mechanism of forest management plan implementation at forest management unit level. Yes, that is quite a lot challenge, but still we have a great potential to improve our forest quality.
And like you mentioned about the timely thinning, and also you mentioned about in the past efforts, thinning is also a very important part in forest management. I want just to clear the concept here. By thinning, we're talking about to cut down some trees, right?
Yes, because when we plant trees in the beginning, it's very dense. There's a lot of trees growing, and after they grow up, there's very limited space for individual tree growth. So we have to make thinning and to adjust their competition and to improve their growth, and it means improve productivity.
So it's like in gardening that sometimes people need to trim down some flowers or grass so that the plant can grow more healthy in a sense.
Yes. So if we just leave that forest over there, there is some trees will be dying. So we have to make thinning and to adjust their competition. And also we can make this chance to adjust our tree species composition. Like I mentioned, we have a lot of pure forests. We can take this opportunity to adjust the tree species composition for the planting some trees under the canopy and to form we call it the mixed forest.
And there are also, I think, a growing debate about the ecological trade-offs of man-made forest, because we do have a large scale of man-made forests here in China. Some critics said that even with the large-scale planting, they did help with problems like desertification and increased forest cover. But as you also mentioned, when it comes to man-made forest, we do have the problem of planting only one type of tree. And that is kind of regarded poorly planned afforestation right now. So I'm also curious about your take on this, and how do you think we can balance, our efforts to try to increase our forest coverage and also improve their quality?
Yes, the debate about plantations is still ongoing. As we know, China had become the first largest plantation country in the world, and the plantations played a very important role in both timber production and ecological service. However, as we mentioned just now, most of them are pure forests, mainly tree species like the bamboo, the poplar, Chinese fir, larch, Mason pine, and eucalyptus. These pure forests have some limitations. For example, the first one, these forests typically exhibit a very simple structure. They are lacking of the shrub layers and the surface vegetations, and also there's a absence of wildlife. So it leads to a limited functional diversity and poor stress resistance, and will increase the susceptibility to pest and disease. The second one, they provide very limited habitats and food source for wild ranges of plants, animals, and microbial species, leading to biodiversity loss. And the third one, most of these forests, a common practice is clear cutting. So it will possibly lead to fragmented forest landscape, and also can drastically alert soil structure, nutrient cycling, and hydrological regimes. So these forests are more vulnerable and less resilient to direct or indirect impacts of climate change due to their limited genetic species and structure diversity. So as for the quality and And the quantity that you mentioned is very important to treat the relationships, the balance. From my opinion, there is a ceiling, ceiling effect for forest area extension, but there's great potential for quality improvement for the large area plantation. So currently, China is in a stage with the emphasis on quality improvement.
And China's also been promoting the concept of, forest as four treasures, 四库. Does that also have something to do with the trying to improve on the quality you just mentioned?
Yes, actually, four forest treasures means the four forest functions, which are water conservation, income generation, green production, and carbon pool. So these functions is very close with the forest quality. I mean that the high quality forest do produce the rich and very strong forest functions, like you mentioned, the four forest functions. So there is all thing that planting trees on hills is equal to constructing reservoirs. So the forest, which is their caterpillar layer, understory layer, leaf layer, and forest soil layer, they intercept, absorb, and store precipitation and act as a big, great sponges and filters, not only recharge groundwater, reduce runoff and erosion, and also regulate the river flow and purify the water. It's reported that annual water conservation capacity of Chinese forest is equal to 16 times the capacity of the Three Gorges Reservoir. Forests also generate the economical income through timber or non-timber forest products like the resins, mushrooms, fruits, fibers, medical plants, and ecotourism, recreation, and ecosystem service with market value like the carbon credits. People always said people living in a mountain are dependent on the forest or green is good.
Yes.
And the forests also provide direct food source, wild fruits, nuts, mushrooms, tea oil, game, edible plants. Besides this, like the FAO also said, the forests also serve as a food safety net in times of crisis. So China also put forward the macro food idea that was put as our national strategy. And the last one, as I mentioned first, as the carbon sink, because trees survive by performing a process we call the photosynthesis, in which trees can consume CO2 and fix it as wood. So the forests represent an immense stock of carbon through the biomass, soil carbon, dead wood, and also litter.
I'm also curious about, does this concept of four treasures something really new, unique to China? And how did we, first of all, how did the idea of four treasures come about?
Actually, as early as in 1989, Chinese President Xi Jinping put forward the three forest treasures in Fujian. That is forest or water conservation, income generation, green production. In 2022, President Xi attended the voluntary tree planting activity in Beijing. We also added another force function as a carbon sink. And also in 2024, President Xi also strengthened the coordination of the four forest treasures. It's for the first time to tell the public by vivid picture that everyone can understand and also emphasized the fundamental and essential role of forests in our social development.
And also, as you just described, the different full functions of forests can play, they do sound like a treasure house to not only our food sources, but also to our climate actions. But I'm also curious about how do other countries view forest? Do you see any, similar or equivalent concept to the four treasures here in China are being used or discussed internationally?
Yes, in fact, there have been a long history of multiple use forest. We call it the ecosystem service, which means the benefits people obtain from ecosystems. In 2000, in Millennial Ecosystem Assessment by United Nations, they categorized them as four types, including the provision service, such as food, timber, and water, regulation service, such as flood and disease control, a cultural service, such as spiritual, recreation, and culture benefits, and also supporting service, such as nutrition, cycling, that maintains the conditions for life on Earth, for example, the biodiversity. I have to emphasize that among the four forest treasures, water conservation and carbon sink are regulating service. Income generation and food production are provision service. These ideas now is widely accepted at home and abroad.
So, as you mentioned, the forest can have the roles in water conservation, can also play a role in carbon sink, which is a massive role we can play when in our goals to reach carbon neutrality. But I'm also curious about when it comes to biodiversity, which is also very important right now, getting recognized internationally. How does this concept of four treasures align with these big environmental goal, on biodiversity conservation?
Well, the four treasures is very close with the broad environmental goals, like you mentioned, the biodiversity conservation. There's the supporting service. For example, the biodiversity conservation is one of the supporting service. Are those that are necessary for the protection of all other ecosystem service, like we just talked about the four forest treasures. There are tremendous research on the relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem functions. And biodiversity has the key roles at all levels of ecosystem service. So when we manage our forests, like we mentioned just now, we make time thinning. We want to make the forest as a rich tree species and very complicated stand structure. That means the structure diversity.
And another quite controversial, I would have to say, and widely discussed roles of the forest, you've also talked about before in this episode, is about their function as carbon sinks. Not only in China, but in other countries, there have been a lot of discussions about, how can we really make count of the carbons and how can we develop, policies or even science behind it? Do we also have some of that challenges here in China when trying to develop our forests as carbon sinks?
Yes, carbon sink is really a hot topic because we faced the global climate change. For my understanding, carbon sinks are quite related with forest growth. As we know, the increment of a forest shows S-shaped curve, which means that the carbon sink will be decreased when forests become old. So currently our forests are quite young and the carbon sink are keeping increased. But we do face the challenges when the forest become old. The sink will be decreased since our government has put forward the carbon neutrality in 2060. So
Mm,
some experts just worried about at that time our forest become old. So this is one challenge that the China faced when developed its carbon sink strategy.
mm,
The second one is the forest quality is low. But
mm,
we still have the improvement gap. According to our research, there is at least one-third gap for carbon sink by silviculture practice. Also, we have the challenge is the climate change and the climate driving disturbance risks, such as snowstorms, extremely droughts, and heat waves, forest fires, pests, and insects. So these risks may fundamentally jeopardize the forest carbon sink. We also need to develop reliable methods to measure and monitor the carbon absorption capacity of a forest. So improving existing forests required careful management to ensure the optimization of multifunctions. That means how we can balance carbon sequestration with preservation of natural habitats, like as I mentioned just now, the biodiversity conservation, timber production. It's also a very complex scientific challenge.
mm.
And also at policy level, engaging the public and raising the awareness about the importance of the forest in combating climate change also is very vital. And how to improve the incentives of like forest farmers, forest farms to manage their forests. And they also need the adequate funding and running regime for forest carbon sink projects, like we just talked about the carbon credits. Yeah.
You mentioned about the improvement gap that your research showed. Can you elaborate a little bit on that concept?
Yes, as I mentioned, the gap, that means for the forest at a specific site, the carbon sink, they have the ceiling. That means they have the maximum carbon sink. But
Mm,
currently, we are far behind the maximum. So the difference between the realized carbon sink and the maximum carbon sink is the gap we need to improve by our careful forest management practice.
that is meaning, for example, by taking steps like thinning or better management or better monitoring that you just mentioned.
Yes, yes, definitely.
Mhm. Since we talked a lot about man made forests, there is also a call for focus on natural forest protection. And how is that different from the plantation programs that we discussed before? And do you think this means a shift in China's forest management?
Yes, natural forests are the main and the most valuable part of the forest resources, and they are the most stable communities and richest in biodiversity among terrestrial ecosystems in nature.
Mm,
In China, the natural forests occupy the 62% by the area and 76% by the volume. So it's the mainstream of our forest. Also, China has become the first largest plantation country in the world. So compared with afforestation and the plantation program, the main objectives of natural forest protection is different.
mm,
In 1998, at that time, the main objectives are to lower the cutting. So that means decrease the cutting trees. And
mm,
in 2015, there's a logging ban. That means we just stopped the harvesting the forest, just leave the keep the thinning.
mm.
And also now to transform the thinning and restoration And also there's other objectives like the green infrastructure construction and community development, capacity building in forest region. So since the initiation of the Nature Forest Protection Program in 1998, great changes have taken place covering the forest structure, forest functions, capacity building, and also community development.
Mm.
Recently, China released its national mid and long-term plan for natural forest conservation and restoration. It targets the future tasks and the goals
Mm.
in future. So yeah, really a quite the significant shift. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, I think forests are definitely getting a lot of tractions among not only among the public, but also among governments and also policymakers at the moment. For example, in this year, COP30, forests will be a key topic at that conference. What do you think, looking into the future, are some of the key priorities that not only China, but also the world should be focusing on if we want to have healthier, better, and more forests?
Let me go back to the basics of forest management in the beginning, the objectives, and how to achieve these objectives. So for the objectives, they are how to maintain and increase the forest ecosystem multifunctionality. As you mentioned just now, the forest for treasures. That is a long-term and a continuous target because we have to wait the tree growing up.
Mm.
And we have faced the same challenges is how to balance multiple ecosystem service and for sustainable forest management and balancing how to use and how to under the conservation of forests, especially with the global challenges from the biodiversity conservation and climate change. Recently, cooperation with WWF, we are working on how to improve the wildlife habitat by forest management, not in natural reserve,
Mm.
but in managed forest. It's a new area, and actually the international communities are also working on this field, but we still have some knowledge gaps, and the ecological intensified and integrated forest management will be the next. And in China, I think the priority should be given to, on the one hand, is the coniferous pure plantation transformation. That means how we can transform our pure conifer forest plantations to mix the conifer broadleaf forests by enriching valuable and local tree species, broadleaf tree species. And on the other hand, we transformed from the natural forest protection to natural forest management. It means how to improve the forest multi-functionality. And with the consideration of the both climate change and the biodiversity conservation, since we have the huge target of the carbon neutrality in 2060, so we have to give the priority to improve forest quality and also the income generation in collective forest region. And information techniques developed very fast. So for the precision forestry area will be coming. There is a great potential in artificial intelligence application in forest management decision making, particularly in monitoring and forecasting forest dynamics under changing conditions and help the foresters for silviculture designing. So based on the big data from remote sensor, such as satellites, drones, and terrestrial sensors like LiDAR, laser scanning, the AI can not only improve the prediction of forest growth and yield, but also can be applied to site classification for the tree site matching and hazard and risk assessment, and also harvest planning. So there will be great potential for the AI applications in forest management. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like a very promising field that you're working on at the moment. And thank you, Professor Lei, today for coming onto the show and clearing the air for us to help us better understand how we should look at our forests. Maybe it's just a small one next door, or maybe it's a bigger one in your suburbs. To better understand this, forests can, I think, influence our daily interaction with them. Thank you, Professor Lei.
It's my pleasure.
From carbon and clean water to food and income, forests do far more than we usually give them credit for. And in China, there is a clear shift happening from focusing on how many trees are planted to how well forests are managed. The country wants to manage forests in ways that support biodiversity, help tackle climate change, and also support local livelihoods. A huge thank you to Lei Xiangdong from the Chinese Academy of Forestry for joining me on the show, and thank you for listening to this episode of Climate Watch. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to follow the podcast, leave a quick review, or share it with a friend. If you have any questions for future episodes or stories you'd like to share, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at fei.fei@cgtn.com, fei.fei@cgtn.com, or find me on my Substack newsletter, Rivers and Mountains. Until next time.